Well, hello everyone. So this is my fifth update, and I wanted to open up by talking a little bit about Prince of Persia. In some ways, it's a bit of an inspiration for Rogue of Vallas. What you're looking at here is actually not the full release. This is the exact version I had when I was a kid. It is the two-level demo, um, and I remember it's kind of playing this, I guess not for hours and hours on end, but I came back to it pretty regularly. And when I was little, I was just really trying to. It bugged me I could not find that room that's in the demo. So I'm not going to wait and let for the demo to play. But the demo room has this room with like a three gap wide pit that you had to jump over, and I kept trying to find it. And of course, I realized later on you can't do that because it's not an actual level. But I want to talk a little bit about the controls of this game. This isn't one I got to. Oops. This isn't one I got to play like the full thing until I got to college, and someone had a Nestor CD that had the Nintendo version of this game on it. And to be honest, I was a little underwhelmed. Maybe it's because I was older or wasn't into this kind of game as much then, or I don't know. But I thought, if I could do something like this myself, I would put some more variety in the gameplay. Make it more like an RPG as opposed to, I think what this is it's kind of an adventure game. Of course, cinematic platformer is the most common thing now. Oh, yeah, when I was little, we called that a skeleton pit. And I think in an earlier, update, I mentioned how me and my brother just kind of spent hours with, that tractor feed printer paper and drawing levels. And I remember we had to include the skeleton pit because of this game. So the controls. For those of you that don't know how this is done, Gordon Mechner, I think is the developer here, basically took some photos of his brother running around and doing everything you see here, and then more or less drew the animations over the drawings. And the net result was getting, like you see here, a much more realistic movement than, what you saw in games at the time. In fact, still games now, actually. This is the kind of movement I would like to get. And I would say one thing I would like to do in this update is show you how I'm implementing this kind of thing in Stencyl. My implementation of cinematic style controls is not as refined as this is, and certainly not as fully developed right now. For one thing, I don't have as many animation frames. I think, if you look at the animation here, there's more frames. I can add that later. I think the first hurdle now is just to get the code. But let me show off some features here that I was working on implementing on my game. So first of all, when you're running and you turn around, you have this little bit of a slide, and the turning is not instant. It takes a little bit of time. So does stopping. So if I let go of the key, you don't just come to a dead stop. You take a few little steps, but it's a different animation. Now another thing is if I just tap the key, you take one step. And if I hold down shift, you can take a baby step. Now one thing that's particularly important about this, actually two things here, and these are definitely features I would like to find a way to implement. Let me go on the other side of this pit here. So if I take baby steps, it'll round that final step off to the very edge of the ledge there. Then I can jump. Oh, well, it doesn't work if you do a regular step. Just a baby step. Yeah, watch here. If I do a baby step, he kind of stops. Now if I take one more, like see, he'll hesitate the first time, but then the second time there's a confirmation. And that works even with the platform there. The other thing, this is a little bit harder to point out, but I want you to watch this jump. Actually, let me go on the other. Let me get a pit here where it's not a pillar. Okay, so I'm going to push the arrow key to jump up here, but watch where he actually jumps. So turn around. So you see how it kind of waited until the very end and then jumped, which made it a little bit easier to get, that the maximum jump possible. Now, I've read some advice on level building and platformer design, and I wish I could. I have the source bookmarked. I just don't have it in front of me. But there is a source where the author said, one of the best practices is to actually let the player jump for just a fraction of a second after they're over the ledge while they're still in the air. I didn't like that approach, but I think is a way to get that leniency without violating physics is to kind of do what this game does and round the jump off until the very edge. Of course, it's not going to let you. There isn't like if I jump from here, it won't actually round it. Let's see. I don't think there's any other motions to show. So yeah. Oh, well, that was interesting. How do I get up here? Okay, do that, and then jump. Yeah, see how it rounds it? Now I already have ledge hang too, so if I jump. Oh no. I guess I jumped too early. I guess that's my cue to exit. Okay, so let's see where I am on this. I'm not far, but kind of the silver lining is the state manager is not complicated enough. I can actually show you how it all works so far without having to skip over anything. But let me run the game first and you can kind of see where I am. Okay, so this is the new version. This isn't the old one that I showed you last time. I'm getting tired of this background. It's a high security compound. I need to make some more levels. Okay, so I have turning. It's a little rough on the edges still, but right now my focus is just getting code right now. I can refine the animations later. Basically solve one problem at a time. Do I have an animation problem or do I have a code problem? There is an animation issue. I think it's code related, which is, she kind of flails her arm a little bit when turning around, and I think it's because it doesn't reverse the order of the animation until the next frame. In fact, I actually set this up where as soon as I tried to turn, it would pause, and I had to unpause it for every single frame. I was able to narrow it down. There's one frame where she's in like that run state, but is pointing the wrong direction. I don't know why that is, but one of the reasons why I wanted to go through this exercise of replacing the animation manager is because it's a lot easier to debug these kinds of things. I don't have the stand turn, so you actually start running either way. I don't have the sachet. What I do have is stopping. Again, I think the animations need to be polished, but like actually, yeah, that's definitely an animation problem there. Her head or her arm does something weird. Anyway, I can fix that. But there's nothing else. Oop. There we go. There's no leniency right now. For one thing, I can't even jump. There's no jump state at the moment. There's no leniency as far as turning around, so she will just whoop, slide off the edge. So yeah, we'll definitely fix that. Okay, so how does this work? It's actually, it's straightforward to me. I'll say it that way. So, behaviors. You see here I have a bunch of state behaviors, but there's two behaviors that are kind of the anchors. State manager that you see here, which all the NPCs will eventually have this as well. And there's also, for the player controls. So let me start with the state manager, because this is actually a relatively, you can see, this is not very long compared to, you can find there's the original animations listener. This is the beast I'm working on getting rid of. I mean, this thing's awful, especially that reset event. That reset event is basically responsible for setting the animation when nothing else is setting it. basically, if another animation ends, it has to figure out what animation to revert back to. And you can see evidence here of issues I've had with this, because all these little print flags here are there to help me identify where something's going wrong. And there's just, all these print statements in here. Here's the problem. If you trigger an event to change an animation, I don't know what method, what function, etc. called that event, which means I can't determine if something is triggering the wrong animation. That's not a big deal if I had a handful of animations, but given that I'm up to around 40, I think is what I counted, and there's still a few more, especially if I want those cinematic style animations. There's going to be a few more of these, and actually what that's going to look like is I'm going to take some of these sprites and then break them up into sub animations. So there's a lot to manage. So here's how I'm approaching this. State Manager is responsible for communicating with all the different behaviors that represent each state. And you can see here, every state has its own behavior, and that behavior houses all of the code that's responsible for dealing with the animations for that state, or the player controls for that state, or any other miscellaneous things, as opposed to what I had before. If I look at this walk and run code, for instance, you can see I already took this old code out. This is what was here. Now I just have a bunch of if checks here to try to determine, is the animation the player is in the list of animations that correspond to walking. This is just, it's grown out of control. It's the gist of it. This is grown out of control. So let me walk through kind of what happens when I start to run. So first of all, the character boots up, so to speak, and the state manager does one thing on startup: set the current state to none. That's actually not a state, by the way. So that's actually going to force a state change. Then there's this thing called roll call. So I thought this was a clever solution. It's not quite as clever as I thought, but I still think it's better than the alternatives. So you see all these different state behaviors here. I need the state manager to be aware that they exist. And the way I've done that is I have this method called roll call, and it's going to trigger the event roll call in every single behavior. And so all these individual state behaviors have the roll call. And what it's going to do, if you go back to the state manager, do you see this? There's a state map. That is a map that links every state to the behavior that manages it. So, for example, when the roll call event triggers on player idle, then I wish there was a block to get the name of the behavior. I just had to hard code that in there. So that's the name of the behavior, but it maps the name of the state. So you can see over here on the right of the screen, the state name is idle. So this manages the idle state. That will map the idle state to this behavior. This is going to allow me to have different behaviors for each state. Or for example, if I want to have an idle state, I can have my choice of behaviors for that state. And I need that because how the idle state works with the player is going to be different than how the idle state works for an NPC, and even different NPCs may have different versions of the idle state. So this is going to allow me to not have to come up with a different state name for every behavior. Everyone can have an idle state, and exactly how that idle state behaves depends on which version of that behavior the actor has. I really like that system. That's going to simplify data management, or maybe just management, I should say, not data management. That's just going to simplify managing this, because now I don't have to worry about what kind of NPC I have. I just say, okay, go into the idle state, and the idle state's behavior will take it from there. Okay, well, the next thing State Manager does is it manages frame updates. And I touched on this in one of my earlier updates. Basically, I need to know whenever the frame changes in an animation so that I can update the per frame hitboxes accordingly. And this is just copied from the original animations listener. I mean, it had this too. No, right there. But it also had this idle update too. And I think that's the first sign that I feel like I'm going in the right direction. So when the player's idle, in fact, let me run the game here. I'll show you. Oh, there. Yeah, I hit enter on the wrong thing. All right, Marika is just gonna stand there for a moment. So she kind of does that, and then she pauses. And then, whoop, there we go. Now, let me run out of move point. Oh, that's not going to work, is it? Okay, that was a silly mistake. I'm going to need a version of this game that I can actually play. Next question is, do I have that? I do. I don't know if you want to watch me look for it. I guess I'll look for it real quick. I know where it is. While I'm talking about this, so let me kind of say, there's two versions of the idle animation. There's the idle animation when Marika is at rest, like full energy, and she's standing there, and she stands for a moment, then turns to face the player and looks kind of annoyed. A lot of the Apogee games and Epic games that I remember playing did that, so I thought, I'll have an idle animation. I need to go to games generated here. I'm still looking for this thing. Alright, there's the backup. Alright, I found it. Okay, version of the game I can actually play. Alright, so the best way to run out of move points is just to try to climb up. But yeah, already that just looks, I mean, so harsh. It's definitely more responsive. That's something I know I'm going to have to be careful about, is to make sure I'm not sacrificing the player's feel of control over their avatar. Then I don't want to over prioritize the animations over that. Okay, so now when she goes idle, see, she's kind of trying to catch her breath, and then when she recovers enough, now she goes back to, just kind of standing there. Okay, so the way that was implemented, if you look at the idle state, or I guess I should say idle animation, not the idle state. You see I have this. But then I also have recovering. That's, she's just kind of, standing there trying to catch her breath. The game has to see both of these as the idle state. Oh, I forgot. I already updated. Never mind. Yeah, it used to be there were 7 more frames. The next 7 frames, I guess actually, this was the first 4 frames of the idle animation. Then the next 3 frames were this. Okay, so now we go back to the original animation listener here. So this idle update, basically what it did is if the player was unrested, it would go back to those first 4 catching her breath animations, and then if she was rested, or not unrested, then when she went into idle, it would skip those recovering animations and go straight to the ones where, the ones I kept, these 3. So, again, originally idle was all 7 of these frames. These were the first 4, those were the last 3, and that idle update would determine whether or not these should be skipped. That's such a clunky way to handle this, and it works. The problem is I need to do more of this kind of thing. I mean, if that was the only time I'd have to do that, a hack is okay. The problem is I don't want to build off a hack. So that's actually one of the things that prompted me to want to do this. So the way I handle this now, let's go back to State Manager. So, okay, I have these, these blocks here to add a state, manage moving states. I'll get to all that later. But on set animation, By the way, I do have a separate block for setting animation instead of using, the one that's provided, that one. The reason why is because every time I set the animation, I need to also update the hitboxes. And setting the frame to -1 is going to force all the hitboxes to update because no frame has a frame of -1, or an index of -1, I should say. Okay, so here's what idle state does. At the end of roll call, I activate the current state, which the current state defaults to idle. By the way, I guess one other detail, I have to delay this by a frame, mainly because I don't know in what order these behaviors are going to be loaded when the actor is created. And that's something that I wish you could do in Stencyl, is specify an order that behaviors are loaded in. And maybe you can, and I just don't know how to do that. But my general rule for this sort of thing is don't make assumptions that behaviors are going to load in any particular order. And that can be particularly troublesome if you have something like a custom block, like you can see in some of my animations here. I have custom blocks. If this block tries to run before the state manager behavior even loads, weird things happen. I would expect it to crash, but that's actually not what happens. Nothing happens, and I think sometimes it somehow poisons the behavior so that they never work. I don't know. It's a weird thing. So I'm just used to not using any blocks in other behaviors in a created event. I always delay them by a frame. And that's okay. This solves the problem. Player doesn't even know it because 1/100th of a second is the very next frame. So it works. So when we activate the idle state, we go to here on activation. We set some preliminary things. Every state, by the way, has some of these same events. But this event here, update animation, sets the animation. And now you can see this is handled much more gracefully. If the player is unrested, go to the recovering animation. And now it's a separate animation like you see it here. Okay, it's not some mishmash of two separate animations in one. It's two separate animations. But it's still the idle state. And I can check if the player's in the idle state now and not have to check if it's one animation or the other or anything like that. And then updating here is going to check. Actually, no, never mind. On frame update, since frame update's called by the state manager, then if this is the particular behavior that's active, then update animation will check this, and that'll check to see if the player has the required move points to go back to the regular idle. It's just a much cleaner way of handling this. Okay, now every one of these state behaviors has the same 4 events: roll call, update animation, activate, and deactivate. In the simplest form, all activate does is turn on this boolean that enables the updating. Every state has its own built-in timer. I don't necessarily use it, but if I want to make a new state, I have a template one. I just copy and paste the template one. So I wanted to set up some features that I thought a lot of the states would need. I don't use do after events. The problem with do after is what happens if the state changes before the event triggers. So for example, let's say this run start, this is the state when the player starts to run, and after I think it's a quarter of a second, 25 ticks, and I need to change that number, that's probably too low, but anyway, after 25 ticks this state should automatically transfer to the run state. Well, if I had a do after instead of this timer, then what would happen is after 0.25 seconds, if the player was no longer in the run start state, like let's say maybe she got hit and went to the damage state instead, I don't want her to start running when that do after triggers. And I could, check for this, of course, which is actually how I've been handling this sort of thing previously. Like, for example, when the player punches. Let me get the punch behavior out here. Where is player punch? Well, stand kick works too. So we'll look at stand kick. So you see how I have these do after timers? I was about to say, see how I have these do after timers? I don't have them anymore. I guess, I already started working on getting rid of them. Anyway, the other thing that could happen is if I go into another state and then back within that 0.25 seconds, in which case the timer needs to start over. But there's nothing to cancel a do after event. I need to somehow cancel it and then start the timer fresh. And handling it this way, with the timer, seems to get rid of that problem. Because now if I get out of the run start state and back into it, when I activate, that timer resets. So that's a little more robust than what I had before. Okay, so player controls would be next. Here's how I handle player controls. I need to get the player control behavior handy. So instead of having the controls checked in every individual behavior, I wanted one behavior that manages all of the controls. And part of that's just for my quality of life. Because, for example, if I put the game in pause, I don't necessarily want to pause all of the controls, but some of them need to be paused. Or at the same time, what if the player is in a certain state? Like, for example, if the player is falling, I don't want them to be able to jump. Things like that. The way I've decided to handle that is I have a player control behavior, and all it does is it listens for the different buttons. So I have left, right, up, down, and 4 action keys. They're defaulted to Z, X, C, and V, but I am planning to let people change that. I know I think it's German keyboards that the Z and the X are probably not the best location for those 2 keys. So this will actually make it easier to allow for custom controls too. But each of these controls triggers an event, and that event is the corresponding behavior in whatever state behavior is active. So that's why I need that state map to know what behavior corresponds to that map or that state. So if the player is in idle, for instance, and when the player pushes the right key, this event is triggered and it will have the player start running. Now, as I get this a little bit further developed, I can check for conditions here if the player can start running. Now, these requests. So there's one more aspect of this. When I set the state, then I need to make sure the player can go into that state. In other words, does it make sense to go from idle to start? And this is probably going to be the most tedious part of this, and probably the only thing that really makes me hesitant to say this is a great idea, is I'm going to have to one by one which states you can transfer to from idle. So, for example, if I don't want it to be possible to go into the damaged state while in idle, I don't have one of these behaviors. And by the way, these behaviors are kind of set up automatically in the state manager. Here's the code for that set state block, and the event is request underscore and then whatever state is trying to trying to transfer to. And all these requests do right now is, in the most simplest form, it just sets a Boolean that says, okay, you can go into the falling state from the idle state. And you can see here, that allow change just sets a Boolean, and then this checks for that Boolean and deactivates the current state and activates the new one. That's going to be a little tedious, to be honest. I'm not looking forward to that because I'm basically going to have a big matrix which state you can go from and to. But the upside of this is it's going to allow me to be a lot more deliberate about how I handle changing between different states. In the simplest form, this just, says, okay, you can go to that state. But in circumstances where I have to, make some more decisions, this gives me a nice way to house that part of the code as opposed to, I can't say this with a straight face, this sort of thing where I'm just checking for all kinds of different quirky conditions that can come up. And there's just a bunch of them. There are so many hacks in this, and I think that's the part of this that made me finally give up on it. It got to the point where I had too many little problems I had to solve with hacks. And like I said, by principle, I don't like having hacks. I also like finishing my projects. So do I want to redesign an entire system because I need to have one hack? No. But at some point it becomes too much. When I have to start working against the system, then it's time to replace it. There's a life lesson in there somewhere too. I don't know what it is. Anyway, that's pretty much, I think, everything I have for you all. So I'm hoping, maybe on next update or two, I'll have a little bit more, and maybe even some of the animations polished that can show you a little bit more about how it works, and hopefully I can tell you it works great. We'll see. This is the beginning of a long road here, but at least I'm far enough along now. I feel like I'm on the right path. We'll just have to see how that plays out. In any case, thank you for watching, and see you next time.